He was called crazy for adopting a poor girl off the street. But a year later, the whole world knew her name. Subscribe. And where you're watching from, post in the comments. The mansion on the edge of Montecito stood silent, wrapped in ivy and stillness. Once a marvel of modern architecture with its angular glass facades and neural-controlled lighting systems, it now looked more like a mausoleum for ambition than a living home. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of dust and disuse, and the only sound came from the slow ticking of an analog clock that had belonged to Margaret Keller, gone now 3 years. Rhyme and rhythm had long since left these hallways. Only shadows remained. Raymond Keller sat in the study, a cavernous room of oak shelves and dead screens, staring at a half-empty glass of water as though it might explain something to him. 60 years old and silver-haired, his posture had stooped only slightly since the boardroom days, but his gaze carried the weight of 10 wars. Once the face of Kilogix AI, tech messiah, futurist, the man who would teach machines to love, he had vanished from public view after the catastrophic failure of the OmniSight project. A project meant to revolutionize predictive behavior recognition through biometric and emotional data. It had ended in global scandal, one suicide, and the ruin of everything Raymond had built over 40 years. The media had a feast, the fall of the Mind King, from billionaire to blunderer. They questioned his mental health, his judgment, even his ethics. Venture capitalists fled like rats from a burning ship. Raymond didn't fight back. He resigned from the board, liquidated the last of his shares, and locked himself inside the only place left untouched by scandal, his home. Day by day, the routine became its own prison. Wake at 7, brew the same coffee, dark, unfiltered, bitter. Sit in the garden and listen to nothing. Check emails he knew wouldn't come. Stare at the ocean through polarized glass. Read the same passages of Bertrand Russell and Marcus Aurelius like prayer, pretending they still anchored him. At night, he would watch old videos of Margaret laughing, speaking French to their dog, rearranging the books he always misplaced. He had no children. That had been a mutual decision, made years ago with the confidence of two people who believed they would live forever in the circuits of their empire. But Margaret had gone first, far too soon, leaving him with a silence no technology could breach. And now, stripped of wealth, reputation, and purpose, Raymond Keller existed like an unplugged machine, still powered by muscle memory, but devoid of signal. It might have continued that way until his death, if not for an email that appeared one morning in his neglected inbox. From a coordinator at the Wessler Foundation, a name he barely remembered. They were honoring a previous pledge he had made, years ago, in better times, to visit one of the inner-city education programs his foundation had sponsored. The kind of PR charity he once did out of obligation, face and name on banners, a staged photo with children he would never remember. He nearly deleted it. But something, a flicker of guilt, boredom, or maybe the ghost of Margaret, made him respond. The visit was scheduled 2 days later. A private car picked him up at the estate and drove him through the winding roads of Montecito, then down the 101 into the industrial outskirts of Brooklyn. The air thickened as they crossed into the borough, grime replacing greenery, concrete swallowing the horizon. The building itself was nondescript, cinder block walls, faded murals, a crumbling flag over the entrance. Inside, the air was a mixture of cafeteria oil, crayons, and institutional disinfectant. Children ran past him with the hyperkinetic energy of the forgotten. Most ignored him, a few stared. A social worker named Leandra walked him through the facility, explaining their goals, showing him rooms filled with outdated computers and posters about self-esteem. He nodded, murmured pleasantries. Then, near the back, they entered a room quieter than the rest. It was a converted storage space, sparsely furnished with a few tables, old math textbooks, and some piles of donated notebooks. At the far corner sat a small girl with dark skin and tightly braided hair. She hunched over a notebook, scribbling with an intensity that looked almost painful. "That's Zoya," Leandra said. "She's a difficult case, bright, withdrawn, doesn't talk much, been here about 6 months, never really fit anywhere else." Raymond's eyes narrowed slightly. "What's she doing?" "Writing, drawing, maybe. She doesn't let us look." He stepped closer. The girl looked up once, briefly. Her eyes were large and dark, not wide with fear or curiosity, but flat, watchful, not like a child's, more like someone waiting for the next disappointment to arrive. "Zoya," he said gently. She blinked but said nothing. Raymond hesitated, then slowly sat on the bench beside her, careful not to invade her space. Over her shoulder, he saw the notebook. It was filled not with doodles, but mathematical notations, dense matrices, integrals, what looked like elements of reinforcement learning theory. He flipped a few pages, and each one stunned him more than the last. Eigenvalues, gradient descent models, statistical entropy, the kind of raw, unstructured thinking that only came from minds not yet tamed by convention. "How old is she?" he asked. 11, Leandra replied. "Tests say her IQ's in the 140s, but we don't really know what to do with her." Raymond didn't speak. His chest had tightened, not with awe, but with recognition. He had seen this once before, in himself, in Margaret. And then the question emerged before he could stop it. What would it take to adopt her? Leandra turned sharply. "You're not serious." "I am," he said. "She's not easy. She's been through a lot." "You're not exactly in a stable position either, Mr. Keller. I read the news." "I didn't ask for your analysis. I asked what it would take." The conversation that followed was uncomfortable. Legal obstacles, background checks, social worker evaluations. Raymond knew he would be seen as an old, eccentric man trying to play savior. He knew people would call him insane. He knew Zoya might never trust him, might never want him. But something inside him had shifted, slowly, like a mechanism being realigned after decades of rust. He returned to the mansion alone that night, but for the first time in over a year, he didn't go straight to his study. Instead, he went to one of the unused bedrooms, Margaret's old workspace, and began clearing it out. The next morning, he called his attorney. By the end of the week, he had filed for temporary guardianship. The media caught wind within days. "Billionaire adopts inner-city girl in PR stunt," screamed the headlines. Pundits speculated about his motives, comedians mocked him on late-night television, and former employees called it a delusional old man's last vanity project. He read every word. Then he turned off the internet. 1 week later, Zoya stood silently at the threshold of his home, clutching a battered backpack, her eyes still guarded, still waiting for the worst. Raymond didn't speak. He only stepped aside and let her in. Neither of them knew it then, but history had just changed course, not with thunder, but with a whisper, the quiet movement of two lives beginning to orbit each other. And behind them, the world kept laughing. The morning sun slanted through the high windows of the Keller estate, casting long rectangles of warmth across the marble floor. Zoya stood near the entrance, her shoulders squared, her face blank. Raymond watched her from the second-floor landing, leaning against the polished brass railing, trying to imagine what the world must look like from behind those guarded eyes. She didn't ask for a tour. She didn't run to explore the maze of hallways or the garden or the antique library his late wife had once curated with love. Instead, she followed the housekeeper silently to the guest room prepared for her, dropped her backpack by the edge of the bed, and closed the door. Raymond didn't press. Children needed time, especially children like her. The media circus began within 48 hours of her arrival. Photos taken by a long-lens camera, Zoya walking beside Raymond into the house, were splashed across gossip sites and business columns alike. Headlines ranged from bemused to outright hostile. Tech titan loses his mind. Raymond Keller adopts mystery girl. Billionaire's last gamble. Is this a child or a project? Mad genius or meltdown? Social media lit up with sarcasm and thinly veiled racism. People dissected Zoya's skin color, her presumed background, her clothing, her silence. They called it performative charity. They accused Raymond of manufacturing a redemption arc. Modern-day Pygmalion, one article jeered, only this time the statue fights back. Raymond read every piece. He printed them, stacked them in a manila folder, and placed it in a drawer in his study. Not out of masochism, but out of discipline. He had learned long ago, never ignore what the world says about you. Study it, then decide what matters. He didn't speak to Zoya about the headlines. She hadn't mentioned them, hadn't seemed to care. But he saw the tension in her spine every time the house phone rang, the way her hand trembled slightly when the doorbell buzzed. She was used to invasions, just not of this kind. For the first few days, their interactions were minimal. She emerged from her room only for meals, always eating quickly, eyes darting from plate to fork as if time was limited. She never left a crumb. She never left a dish. She asked no questions. On the fourth evening, as the sky turned orange behind the garden trellis, Raymond found her sitting in the conservatory. She had dragged a heavy chair to the corner and was curled up with a notebook in her lap. The light caught her braids, turning them bronze at the edges. He stood silently in the doorway, not wanting to disrupt her. Then he noticed what she was writing. Equations. Again. But these were different from the ones he had seen in the notebook at the shelter. More refined, tighter, as if she had begun organizing her raw intuition into formal logic. He cleared his throat gently. She looked up, expression unreadable. "May I see?" he asked. She hesitated, then handed the notebook over without a word. He sat opposite her and flipped through the pages. Linear regressions, time series analysis, Bayesian filtering. She wasn't just smart, she was operating at a level most graduate students struggled to reach. "These are interesting," he said understatedly. She shrugged. "I was bored. Do you want access to a computer?" A nod. That night, he had an old server rig brought up from the basement, one of the last machines from his personal R&D lab, built with privacy and speed in mind. He installed a clean OS and handed her admin credentials. "No filters," he said, "but everything you do is logged. Not because I don't trust you, but because I want you to remember this is real. It's your machine. Your work matters now." She said nothing, but he saw the slightest tightening at the corners of her mouth, a near smile. Almost. The days began to shift. Zoya settled into a rhythm. She would wake early, long before the staff, and bury herself in the study. She watched programming lectures, read white papers, and dissected open-source code repositories with the ferocity of someone starving for knowledge. She hardly spoke to anyone, but her presence filled the house like static electricity. quiet, constant, charged. Raymond kept his distance at first. He didn't want to push, but one evening he found her debugging a line of code that had stumped even him. She was muttering to herself, chewing on the back of a pen. He sat beside her, said nothing. 10 minutes passed. Then she looked up and said, matter-of-factly, "The loop condition's too broad. You're feeding it infinite nulls." He blinked. She was right. He hadn't even noticed. "You should write a paper," he said. "I don't want anyone to know it's me," she replied. Outside the estate, the world kept buzzing. A former board member from Kellogix gave a snide interview, implying Raymond was spiraling into a late-life delusion. One of his ex-partners publicly questioned his mental stability. Stock bloggers speculated that he had lost his fortune and was clinging to a child for relevance. Even some of his old allies sent messages of concern, cloaked in politeness but barbed with judgment. Raymond didn't respond to any of it. What would be the point? But one morning, Zoya came to breakfast with a printout in her hand. It was an op-ed written by a tech columnist titled "When Billionaires Playhouse." She laid it on the table. "Is it true?" He looked at her. "That you're crazy?" He folded the paper slowly. "Depends who you ask." "Why did you pick me?" He didn't have a polished answer. He could have talked about recognizing her talent, about his admiration for her mind. But instead, he said, "Because I saw you. And I don't think anyone else did." She didn't reply, but she sat a little straighter. Raymond decided to enroll her in one of the top private academies in the state. He pulled favors, leaned on old allies, paid a generous endowment. The headmaster nodded, the paperwork was processed, and Zoya was issued a uniform and schedule. Her first week was a disaster. The students were cold, some cruel. One girl whispered loud enough for Zoya to hear, "She doesn't even talk. Is she, like, broken?" A boy in her math class mocked her accent, which barely existed. Teachers, though polite, didn't know how to challenge her. She corrected one instructor mid-equation. Instead of praise, she received a detention slip for disruption. Raymond attended the parent-teacher meeting with clenched fists. The headmaster talked about behavioral adjustment and fitting in socially. "She's not here to fit in," Raymond said calmly. "She's here to learn." That night, Zoya refused to eat dinner. "I don't need school," she said. "They're afraid of me." "You need people," he said. "I need peace." The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. Raymond withdrew her from the school and instead hired a private tutor in advanced mathematics, someone who had once taught at Stanford and owed him a favor. Zoya took to the new setup instantly. The tutor reported back weekly, always with the same message: "She's unlike anything I've seen." As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in the house changed. Zoya began to ask questions about Margaret, about the company, about the scandal that had broken Raymond's life. He answered carefully, truthfully. She asked why he hadn't fought back. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," he said. "It does," she replied. He began to realize that he was no longer teaching her. She was teaching him about resilience, about quiet fire, about how the most broken things sometimes held the most power. The media eventually grew bored. The headlines faded. A new scandal took center stage, and in the silence that followed, Raymond and Zoya found their rhythm, not as savior and rescued, but as two minds orbiting the same invisible sun. She started calling him R. He didn't ask for more, not yet, but in the privacy of his study, where her notebooks now occupied entire shelves, where the old machines hummed again with purpose, he allowed himself the smallest hope. Perhaps he wasn't mad after all. Perhaps he had simply remembered how to begin again. The first rains of October came as a whisper, dusting the windows of the estate with fine mist, softening the edges of the world. Zoya sat cross-legged on the floor of what had once been the music room. The piano was gone now, sold during the early years of Raymond's withdrawal, when silence had seemed preferable to nostalgia. In its place stood rows of whiteboards, thick with equations and half-formed models, and a clutter of devices, laptops, tablets, a soldering station, and several stacks of academic journals. The room had become hers without anyone saying so. She had claimed it slowly, methodically, first by spending her mornings there, then her nights, until even the staff referred to it as Zoya's lab. She never gave it a name, but in her hands the old room transformed into something alive, a hybrid of study and sanctuary. Raymond rarely entered uninvited. He understood the sanctity of creative space. He had once needed the same. Zoya was evolving. That much was undeniable. Her questions had grown sharper, her silences more loaded. She now read technical manuals without blinking, and debated with Raymond over concepts he had developed in the founding years of Kilogics. Not mimicking, challenging. She was not just absorbing knowledge, she was shaping it. One evening, as Raymond passed by the open door, he heard a low hum, the unmistakable rhythm of a system under test. He stepped inside and found Zoya crouched beside a terminal, watching a simulation run through thousands of iterations in a matter of minutes. On the screen, colored nodes flickered, faded, regrouped, and pulsed again. "What is it?" he asked. "It's learning," she said without looking up. "I built an adaptive agent to test feedback in an ambiguous environment. No set goal, just behavior tracking." Raymond leaned closer, watching the chaotic swirl of data form patterns and then dissolve. Without hard-coded objectives. She nodded. "I wanted to see if it would invent its own." "And?" "It did," she said, finally turning to him. "It started assigning value to stable response patterns, like humans do. Preference through repetition." He sat down beside her, silent. A year ago, he might have dismissed such a thing as theoretical fancy. Now it felt inevitable. "You should give it a name," he said eventually. She shrugged. "It's just a prototype. Everything important starts that way." She thought for a moment. Z1. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at a printout of Zoya's notes, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Awe. Not at the technology, but at her. The clarity of her thinking, the precision of her logic. She was only 11, yet already building systems that mirrored the cognitive subtleties of emotion, preference, and instinct. And she did it not from ambition, but from need, as if the chaos of the world could only make sense when reduced to symbols and equations. It was time to support her more directly. The next day, Raymond reached out to a contact he hadn't spoken to in years. David Leland, a former CTO of a now-defunct tech incubator, once renowned for his discretion and technical prowess. They met at a quiet cafe outside Santa Monica. "She's that good?" David asked, not hiding his skepticism. "Better," Raymond said. "She sees code the way composers see music." David raised an eyebrow. "And you want?" "A space. Discreet. Protected. Somewhere she can build." David took a breath. "You're serious." "I've never been more serious." Within a week, they had leased a nondescript facility in an industrial park an hour outside the city. It looked like a warehouse from the outside, but inside it was clean, climate-controlled, and network-isolated. No signs, no cameras, no noise. Zoya said nothing when he showed it to her. She simply walked through the space, touching the walls, checking the acoustics, and examining the server racks. Then she turned to him and said, "I want to try something new." "What do you mean?" "I want to build an AI that doesn't just react to the world, but understands why it reacts the way it does." Raymond frowned. "Emotion modeling?" "Cognitive self-recursion," she replied. "A system that rewrites its own priorities based on context, not instruction." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's dangerous." She looked at him evenly. "So is ignorance." Work began immediately. Every morning they drove out together, he in silence, she lost in thought. The facility became an extension of their home. There, Zoya was more animated, more vocal, more herself. She began referring to her project as Zoe, a recursive acronym she refused to explain. Raymond didn't press. He was learning to let her reveal things in her own time. She worked tirelessly, often through the night. He'd find her asleep on the floor, curled beneath a blanket with circuit boards scattered like leaves around her. He began leaving food outside the lab door, not wanting to interrupt. Sometimes she ate. Sometimes she forgot. One afternoon, he brought in an old colleague, Dr. Ellen Voss, a data ethicist who had co-authored several influential papers on AI safety. Zoya greeted her with wary politeness, then grilled her for 2 hours on epistemic boundaries, algorithmic opacity, and moral bias in coding. Afterward, Ellen pulled Raymond aside. "She's not a child." "She is," he said. "But she's also something else." Zoya's breakthroughs began to accelerate. She rewrote the kernel of her learning model to include emotional reinforcement triggers, an idea no one had dared attempt at scale. She then layered it with a socio-contextual inference engine that allowed Zoe to adapt not just to data, but to environments. Raymond watched in astonishment as the system adjusted its own parameters mid-task, redirecting its strategy based on indirect cues. "She's creating something that doesn't just answer," Ellen said. "It reflects." Raymond knew. He had seen glimpses of such potential before, in the earliest days of Omnisight, when dreams still felt safe. But this was different. Zoya wasn't driven by glory or profit. She was driven by a desire to make order out of a world that had failed her too many times. And then one evening, everything shifted. It was nearly midnight when Raymond wandered into the lab. He found Zoya standing in front of a projection screen, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The screen showed a looping sequence. Zoe responding to a set of seemingly contradictory inputs and then freezing. "It's confused," she muttered. "Why?" "I gave it a scenario that violates its own rules." He watched as the system hesitated, then tried a different pathway. "You realize what this means?" she said quietly. "What?" "It's not just reacting anymore. It's choosing." Raymond felt the hair on his arms rise. Over the next week, Zoya refined the system until it could not only detect logical paradoxes, but develop heuristics to resolve them based on prior interactions. She had, without quite meaning to, created a form of synthetic introspection. Zoe was not sentient, not in any traditional sense, but it was closer than anything humanity had ever seen. She printed out the final schematic and handed it to him. "It's done." He looked at the page. "What now?" She paused. "Now we teach it why it matters." They began preparing to test Zoe in a real-world application, a learning interface for underperforming students. Zoya wanted to see if her system could identify latent potential the way she had been overlooked. Raymond reached out to an inner-city school he had once funded, offering a pilot program with no publicity. They agreed. The early results were staggering. Students who had been labeled incapable suddenly showed progress, not just academic but emotional. The system adapted to them, encouraged them, and rewarded their efforts not with points but with acknowledgement. A message, a soft tone, a moment of recognition. Zoya watched the footage obsessively. "This is what I needed," she whispered once. "Back then." Raymond placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're giving it to others now." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. That night, as they drove back through the darkened highway, Raymond glanced at her. Her face was lit by the screen of her tablet, eyes focused, calculating. "You've built something extraordinary," he said. She nodded. "Now we see if the world is ready." He didn't know whether it was, but he knew Zoya was. Winter came slowly to California, dressing the air in a thin, dry coolness that offered no snow but whispered change in every breeze. At the estate, everything appeared calm on the surface. The garden's late roses still bloomed, the lights still glowed warmly behind curtains in the early dusk, and the morning routines continued as if nothing in the world had altered. But inside the walls, especially within the clean, humming space of the warehouse-turned-lab, there was tension, low and constant, like a wire stretched just past its comfort. Zoya had become more withdrawn, though not in the way of sulking or fatigue. Her attention had deepened. She no longer worked for the sake of exploration. She worked like someone racing against time, like something had begun ticking in the background, and only she could hear it. Raymond noticed it in the way she paused mid-sentence as if remembering something she hadn't said, or the way she reviewed system logs with an urgency he couldn't attribute to mere curiosity. She never explained. But the shift was undeniable. They had completed Phase 1 of the educational pilot. Zoe, in its early prototype form, had already shown results that no commercial adaptive learning system had ever managed. It didn't just teach, it reached. It found the threads buried under failure, under poverty, under systems designed to forget certain types of minds, and gently pulled them forward. Raymond had begun quietly expanding the infrastructure around the project, bringing on a small team of trusted developers under pseudonyms, insulating the code from exposure, encrypting backups and redundancies across multiple off-site servers. Zoya had designed the security protocols herself. She didn't trust anyone else, not with this. The only thing she hadn't accounted for was noise. It came first in the form of a leaked photo, blurry, low resolution, clearly taken through the tinted window of a car. It showed Raymond standing beside a young black girl, gesturing toward what appeared to be an industrial complex. The caption beneath it on the gossip blog was simple: "The Keller child. What is she really working on?" Raymond read it in the quiet of his study, the screen's glow pale against the darkened walls. He didn't call Zoya. He didn't want to startle her. But the moment he entered the lab the next morning, she was already sitting at the terminal, scanning digital trails. "They got too close," she said before he could speak. "Do you know who?" "It's a botched op. Someone amateur. Probably sold the photo without knowing what it meant." "And what if someone figures it out?" "They will," she said simply. "Eventually." Raymond looked at her. She wasn't afraid. She was preparing. The second wave came harder. An anonymous tip, delivered to several outlets at once, alleged that Raymond was exploiting a minor for technological gain, using her for research she was too young to consent to. A journalist from a major investigative program contacted Raymond's office, requesting comment before this story moves forward. Someone had been feeding them half-truths laced with malice. A former Kellogg's board member was quoted off record, "He was always a bit unstable. She's a project to him, not a person." Raymond went white when he read it. He knew that voice, knew the cadence. Evan Thorne. It was only a matter of time before Evan appeared again. He had laid low after the Omnisite scandal, repositioned himself under a new company, Vedanta Analytics, and managed to attract venture capital by presenting himself as the reasonable one, the practical mind who had been overruled by idealism. He had never publicly attacked Raymond before, but now it was clear he had caught the scent of Zoe. Raymond knew Evan well. He wasn't interested in proving his superiority. He was interested in owning what he couldn't build. Zoya's system, if deployed globally, would not only overshadow his work, it would expose it. The code she had developed unraveled the very techniques Evan had once patented: predictive behavior tracking, emotion-based marketing algorithms, strategic data interference to control public response. She hadn't meant to attack him. She had simply written better truth. But Evan, Raymond knew, wouldn't care about the distinction. The attack shifted from whispers to institutions. One afternoon, an unannounced visit from a representative of Child Protective Services arrived at the estate. The woman, crisp in a navy blue blazer, introduced herself as Marcy Whitaker and produced a warrant for a wellness evaluation. Zoya was in the lab. Raymond tried to stall. He offered coffee, documentation, transcripts, educational reports, but Marcy insisted. She needed to see the girl. "I just want to ensure she's safe," she said. "There have been concerns." Raymond clenched his jaw but called Zoya in. She entered with her usual composure, eyes steady, chin raised just enough to communicate that she knew exactly what this was. Marcy began asking questions, at first gently, then with the suggestive undertone of someone fishing for dysfunction. "Do you feel comfortable here?" "Yes." "Do you ever feel pressured to work on things you don't understand?" "No." "Do you miss being around other children?" Zoya paused. "Children didn't want me. He did." Raymond watched, heart pounding, but Marcy only nodded, writing something down. The interview ended with handshakes and polite phrases, but as soon as the door closed behind her, Zoya turned to Raymond. "She wasn't alone," she said. "She had a recorder in her bag." He didn't ask how she knew. He had stopped questioning the sources of her intuition. The next week brought more visits. One from an education oversight body, another from a medical examiner demanding proof of physical and mental well-being. Someone was orchestrating a campaign, slowly tightening the rope. It wasn't about removing Zoya. It was about isolating her, discrediting the guardian, destabilizing the structure, pushing her into a foster system that would neutralize her brilliance. Raymond knew the game. They needed to disappear. Late one night, he entered the lab. Zoya was sitting on the floor, surrounded by wires and flash drives. Her eyes were bloodshot, her fingers stained with ink and graphite. "We have to move the project," he said. "I already did," she replied. He blinked. "What?" "I anticipated the breach. The core files are encrypted, fragmented, and seeded into multiple academic networks under false credentials. I also uploaded a deadman switch. If someone accesses them without the correct phrase, they wipe themselves." Raymond stared at her. "You built all that without telling me?" She looked up. "I trust you, but I don't trust the world." He didn't argue. He couldn't. They initiated the evacuation protocol the next morning. Zoya and her system would go to a secure location, an off-grid farmhouse once owned by one of Raymond's cousins. There, she would be unreachable, and the data would remain safe. Raymond would stay behind, maintain appearances, and deflect suspicion. The goodbye was brief. She hugged him with the sudden intensity of someone twice her age and whispered, "Keep them looking at your hands while I work behind their back." He almost cried, but he didn't. The day she left, he returned to the empty lab. The screens were off, the hum was gone. For the first time in months, the air felt still. He sat alone and waited. The next morning, he received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a note. "We're still building. Stay loud. Keep them blind." The threat had returned, but so had the resistance. Raymond Keller sat in the dim quiet of his study, the envelope open before him, the flash drive inserted into a small, offline laptop, shielded from network detection. The room, once brimming with quiet hums and the familiar rhythm of analysis, now felt hollow without the presence of Zoya. Her absence had lengthened the nights. The silence was not peaceful. It was alert, poised, bristling with invisible weight. On the screen, lines of code scrolled slowly. The message from Zoya wasn't just reassurance. It was the foundation of a counterstrike. She had written a full report, meticulously annotated, time-stamped, and secured with authentication only he could access. Within the encrypted folders were logs, compiled data sets, reconstructed packet paths, and one central model. A simulation that traced how Evan Thorne had not only infiltrated the OmniSite project years ago, but had executed a silent sabotage that led to its collapse. The code Zoya had uncovered from buried logs showed a sequence of artificial delay triggers, minimal packet reroutes, randomized input disruption, and forced regression cycles, all masked under the appearance of hardware failure. She had found it not in the remnants of Kelogix, but in an academic repository buried under a different author's name, a pseudonymous publication that mimicked a failed research thesis, but whose structure matched Evan's signature patterns. Zoya had unmasked it not by recognition but by behavior, algorithmic fingerprinting through a new method she had built. She called it reflex mapping. Raymond read through her annotations with growing disbelief. Each line was a revelation. She had modeled not just the data trail, but the motivation, how Thorne's shell corporations had benefited from the collapse, how a chain of redirected investments had fed quietly into Vedanta Analytics, and how the current pressure on Zoe wasn't merely competitive, but retaliatory. Evan hadn't just come for Raymond. He had come for the system that dared to restore what he'd destroyed. By the time Raymond reached the end of the report, dawn was creeping over the Santa Ynez Hills. He hadn't moved in hours. He rose slowly and poured himself coffee with unsteady hands. This was no longer about legacy or guilt or recovery. It was a war, and Zoya had already begun fighting it. The first thing he did was reach out to someone he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Sarah Ewan, a systems architect and cryptographic specialist who had once been Raymond's lead engineer before leaving Kelogix under quiet, abrupt circumstances. They had parted on respectful but strained terms after a disagreement over the direction of OmniSite. She had disappeared into private contracts and academic circles, unreachable through conventional means, but Raymond still had her real address. He drove 3 hours north to a secluded part of Northern California where the coastline curved into forest and the roads turned gravel. Her house was small, angular, half buried in the hill, surrounded by redwoods and quiet. She opened the door before he knocked. "I was wondering how long it would take you," she said. He held out the flash drive. Sarah accepted it without another word. Inside, she read silently for almost an hour, sitting cross-legged on the floor, the only sound the faint tick of her analog wall clock. When she finished, she looked up. "Your girl's not just a genius," she said. "She's terrifying." "She's mine," Raymond said simply. Sarah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from respect earned, not given. They worked together through the night. Sarah examined the structures Zoya had laid out, cross-checked server signatures, and reconstructed terminal logs. She confirmed everything. Then she added more: older files, access records from her final month at Kilogix, showing that even back then someone had been tunneling into their development network through administrative back doors Sarah hadn't authorized. "I knew something was off," she muttered. "That's why I left. But I didn't have proof. Now we do." They created 3 copies of the full archive, one for Sarah's secure repository, one encrypted in cold storage, and one physical, on a drive locked with biometric access. Then, using Zoya's reflex mapping, they began tracing the behavioral anomalies that were currently spreading through financial tech networks. Glitches, silent delays, mysterious input loops reported by low-tier fintech startups across North America and Europe. It was Evan, or someone using his model. He wasn't just coming for Zoe. He was destabilizing the entire regulatory framework that might one day recognize it. Raymond understood the strategy instantly. If he could discredit the environment into which Zoe was born, he could invalidate Zoya's work before it reached maturity. They had to act fast. Raymond returned to the city, but this time he was not hiding. He began making appearances again, not at news conferences or televised panels, but in the shadows where real influence lived. He attended quiet dinners, closed-door symposia, and whispered conversations among old technocrats who still remembered what he had once been. He spoke little, but what he did say mattered. We all know OmniSight didn't fail on its own. Eyes flicked across tables. Conversations slowed. We all know someone pushed it. No names, no accusations, just suggestion. But it was enough. In parallel, Sarah and Zoya, now in a constant encrypted communication, built a trap. Zoya, working from the rural safe house, began constructing a simulation, one that mirrored Evan's sabotage, line for line, but injected new signatures. The goal wasn't to expose him directly. It was to bait him into reacting, into trying to discredit or contain what looked like a digital twin of his own tactic. The simulation was deployed through a dummy platform, a shell company pretending to offer a new risk assessment tool for emerging markets. Within 24 hours of its quiet release, it was flagged, reported, and traced directly to an internal team within Vedanta Analytics. They had him. Raymond and Sarah now began compiling a full legal dossier, over 300 pages. Included were copies of Zoya's discoveries, Sarah's logs, financial statements showing money laundering routes through shell companies in the Caymans, and false credentialing in academic publications. It was airtight, but the timing had to be perfect. While the legal team prepared a targeted delivery to regulatory bodies, Raymond decided they needed one final piece: public anchoring. Something undeniable. Something that would ensure the world couldn't look away even if it wanted to. That's when Zoya sent him the final prototype. It was not just a paper or a code library. It was a live AI engine, a model so refined it could demonstrate real-time algorithmic manipulation across multiple financial networks simultaneously, identify it, isolate it, and model the original intent. It didn't accuse, it revealed. Raymond stared at the interface. It was beautiful, elegant, devastating. They called it Zoe V3. He took a breath. It's time. They split the release into 3 stages. The first was a soft leak to academic circles under the guise of open-source research. The second, a series of anonymous reports submitted to national regulatory commissions. And the third, a direct file transfer to 3 trusted investigative journalists in New York, London, and Berlin. Then they waited. It took 2 days. The Berlin report hit first, the algorithm that sees too much. Within hours, the financial sector began to convulse. The New York piece followed The Child Who Built the Firewall. And finally, London, Genius in Exile, How a Girl from Nowhere Exposed a Billion-Dollar Lie. Raymond watched the media storm explode in real time. There were live debates, emergency board meetings, government inquiries. Suddenly, everyone was asking the same question. Who is Zoya? And why had no one listened sooner? 2 days later, Evan Thorne was arrested under suspicion of cyber manipulation, corporate sabotage, and financial fraud. Vedanta's offices were raided, stocks plummeted. Former partners turned state's witnesses. Raymond received no calls of congratulations. He didn't expect any. Instead, he packed a bag, drove out to the farmhouse, and knocked on the door. Zoya opened it in silence. He held out a copy of the Wall Street Journal. Her face was on the cover. She stared at it for a long time. Then she said, "Good." Raymond nodded. "It's not over, but it's started." She stepped aside and let him in. The genius had struck back, and the world would never forget her name again. The morning after Evan Thorne's arrest, the world was no longer the same. The markets did not crash, not immediately. What happened instead was quieter, more profound. A pulse moved through the global financial system, not a tremor, but a slow, irreversible shift in gravity. Banks called emergency meetings. Investment firms froze their automated trading algorithms. Regulatory agencies sent internal memos with words like anomaly, compromise, and immediate audit. It was not panic. It was awakening. At the center of it all was Zoe v3. The open-source release had reached millions in a matter of hours. The architecture of the system, clean, annotated, intuitive, defied belief. It wasn't just another watchdog script or regulatory patch. It was an entirely new framework for analysis, capable of scanning active algorithms in real time, identifying patterns of manipulation, and constructing visual maps of causal inference chains. For the first time, institutions could see how individual decision nodes, buried within complex systems, had been engineered to act against the interests of transparency. It was not just a tool. It was a mirror, and many didn't like what they saw. Inside the Keller farmhouse, now turned makeshift command center, the atmosphere remained calm. Zoya sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of tea, her laptop open before her. Lines of data pulsed across the screen like quiet breathing. Raymond sat nearby, his own device linking into mirrored servers across the globe, tracking responses from financial, academic, and political entities. They had expected attention. They had not expected reverence. Within 24 hours, the name Zoya Keller was trending globally, not as a scandal, not as a curiosity, but as a phenomenon. News outlets scrambled to profile her, but all they had were scraps, a few photos, a name on a court filing, and speculation. The few known facts, that she had been adopted by Raymond Keller, that she was only 12 years old, and that she had developed one of the most significant algorithmic breakthroughs in modern history, were enough to ignite the imagination of a watching world. "She doesn't want interviews," Raymond told reporters. "She wants impact." And yet, her silence only fueled the mystique. The press called her the ghost genius, the girl who saw everything, the black box whisperer. Some speculated that she was a collective, a cover for a team of rogue developers. Others theorized that she had been secretly educated in a government facility. Conspiracy forums lit up. Fan pages appeared overnight. Zoya watched none of it. She remained focused, always on the system. On Zoe. On refining its interface, hardening its resistance to corruption, and ensuring that it could not be sold, bought, or controlled. She began encoding distributed learning modules, self-contained units of code that could spread independently across systems, updating themselves and improving through decentralized consensus. "This isn't just protection," she told Raymond one night. "It's inoculation. Against them." He nodded, understanding more than he let on. He knew that them was not just Evan or Vedanta or the institutions that had failed her. Them meant the entire structure that rewarded silence, punished questions, and erased the inconvenient. But the victory was not without consequence. Within days of the publication, Raymond received a message from a senior agent within the Securities and Exchange Commission. Not a subpoena, not yet, but a warning. Multiple high-level entities were preparing legal action against the Zoe model, claiming it constituted proprietary infringement and economic disruption. "They want it pulled," the agent said, voice low. "They'll call it unsafe. They'll call it a threat to market integrity." "It is a threat," Raymond replied, "to fraud. They don't see the difference." The lawsuits began soon after. Not from Evan, he was facing criminal charges, but from shadow corporations with vague affiliations representing unnamed investors. The claims were absurd on the surface. Theft of intellectual property, unlawful deployment of unlicensed surveillance software, and endangerment of critical economic infrastructure. Raymond met with Sarah, who had returned to help defend the system. Together, they built a legal firewall. Every line of code in Zoe had been written from scratch. Every idea had citations, precedents, and clear authorship. But the lawsuits weren't meant to win. They were meant to stall, to slow Zoe's spread, to delegitimize Zoya. Raymond made the call. It was time to step into the light. He arranged for a single public appearance, not on television, not at a press conference, but at a private event hosted by the National Science and Ethics Consortium, a gathering of researchers, students, and policymakers known for its sober tone and refusal to engage in spectacle. Zoya would give a talk. The announcement alone triggered headlines. When she stepped onto the stage, a slight figure in a plain navy dress, her braids pulled back, eyes steady, the room fell into total silence. She stood behind the podium for a moment, just breathing. Then she said, simply, "I am not a story." There was a pause, a rustle. Then she continued, "I didn't ask to be known. I didn't build Zoe to be admired. I built it because I wanted to understand the world that tried to forget me. I built it because I believed that understanding is the first step toward justice." The speech was short, less than 10 minutes, but it echoed for hours. When she finished, the room rose in a standing ovation, not out of celebration, but recognition. She wasn't a prodigy, she was a reckoning. The consortium released an open endorsement of Zoe's framework, calling it a necessary evolution of algorithmic integrity. Universities followed, issuing open letters of support. Students began contributing to Zoe's decentralized modules. A movement had begun, not just technological, but ethical. Raymond watched it unfold with quiet pride. He received letters, thousands of them, from parents of gifted children who had been told they were broken, from teachers who saw in Zoe a way to reach their most difficult students, from programmers, analysts, and even traders who admitted that the system had helped them see their own work in a new light. And then, at last, the ruling came. The federal court dismissed the lawsuits, citing Zoe's academic origin, public benefit, and transparent documentation. It was a landmark decision, one that would be studied for years. Zoya had not just survived the machine. She had reprogrammed it, but for her, the most important moment came quietly. Raymond found her sitting on the back porch of the farmhouse, watching the sun dip low over the hills. He sat beside her, offering no words. After a while, she spoke. "Is it really over?" "No," he said, "but it's ours now." She nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, the evening wind soft and cool. The girl who had once sold paper cranes for $1 had brought the financial world to its knees, not with vengeance, but with vision. And she was just getting started. The final snow of winter melted slowly in the hills above Santa Ynez, leaving behind a landscape damp with potential. It was a quiet, unremarkable March morning when the official envelope arrived. Raymond found it on the porch, tucked under a folded newspaper, marked with the seal of the California Superior Court. He carried it inside without ceremony, though his heart beat faster with each step toward the kitchen. Zoya sat at the table with a bowl of oatmeal in front of her, half-eaten, her attention fixed on the screen of her tablet. The numbers dancing across it looked like stock trends but weren't. Some hybrid model she was testing on decentralized voting behavior. He placed the envelope beside her. She didn't look up. "It came?" He nodded. She opened it slowly, carefully, as if the weight of the paper mattered. Her eyes scanned the printed lines once, twice. Then she folded it back and slid it across the table. They said yes. Raymond stared at her, unsure for a moment if he had heard correctly. "You're my daughter now," she said, not smiling but certain. He opened the envelope and read the ruling again for himself. The ink was fresh, the stamp bold. The court recognizes Raymond Elias Keller as the lawful adoptive father of Zoya Amari Keller. The decision was final, immediate, absolute. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she stood, walked to his side of the table, and embraced him. It was not a hesitant, childlike hug. It was firm, lasting, wordless. He closed his eyes and held her. The papers were only a formality, but they were a symbol of what had always been true. She had chosen him, and he had chosen her. Life did not slow after the ruling. If anything, it accelerated. The Keller Foundation, once a modest shell built for tax structure, was restructured and reborn. Under Zoya's direction and with Sarah's help, they launched the Phoenix Initiative, an international program offering direct scholarships, access to advanced learning systems, and mentorship for high-potential children from underprivileged backgrounds. The goal was simple: find those whom the system missed and give them tools to change it. The first cohort was small, 20 students from 5 countries, each with stories that mirrored Zoya's in subtle ways. Children who had been dismissed, mislabeled, isolated. Some came from cities, others from rural schools with no internet access, others from war zones or fractured families. They arrived at the newly converted Keller campus, a refurbished set of buildings near Monterey, with wide eyes and cautious spirits. Zoya met them on the first day. She stood in front of them with no ceremony, no script, just presence. "My name is Zoya," she said. "You don't have to impress me. You're already here. That's enough." Over the following months, she visited their workshops weekly, sometimes teaching, sometimes just listening. The students gravitated to her, not because of fame, which she still refused to acknowledge, but because she understood something few adults did. She didn't see them as fragile. She saw them as unfinished. Her teaching style was unusual. She asked questions no one could answer, then waited. She didn't correct mistakes. She made students find the flaw themselves. Her favorite phrase was, "Start over, but not from scratch." Raymond watched it all unfold from a modest office overlooking the campus courtyard. He had taken a backseat role, not out of fatigue, but respect. Zoya didn't need a guide anymore. She needed space. Still, their routines continued. Every Friday night they returned to the farmhouse. She cooked once in a while, or they ordered takeout. They argued over ethical frameworks, laughed over statistical errors, and occasionally sat in complete silence, watching the sky. One night, as they sat on the porch under a moonless sky, Zoya said, "Do you think people will ever stop asking if I really built it?" Raymond exhaled slowly. "Probably not." "Good," she said. "That means they're still looking." He smiled. Another program was added to the Phoenix Initiative that spring, a course on digital ethics and algorithmic responsibility. Zoya insisted on teaching it herself. She structured the course not around textbooks, but around cases, real stories of systems gone wrong, data used as weapons, bias hidden in code. She brought in speakers from varied backgrounds: engineers, ethicists, historians, even activists. The conversations were raw, often uncomfortable. She told her students, "Your job isn't just to write good code, it's to ask who it serves and who it doesn't." In one session, a student asked, "But what if the ones in charge don't care?" Zoya answered without hesitation, "Then you build something they can't ignore." The media tried to re-enter her life, but she kept them at arm's length. The few statements she gave were brief, focused, and impersonal. She declined television interviews, award ceremonies, and honorary degrees. She turned down a 7-figure publishing deal. "I'm not a brand," she told the publicist. "I'm a person. That's more than enough." But not everyone respected her boundaries. One day, federal agents came to the campus, not with threats, but with offers. They spoke to Raymond first, with careful language and veiled propositions. Zoe, they said, had potential in national defense. With slight modifications, it could be used to track insurgent communication patterns, prevent cyber attacks, even model the social behavior of hostile populations. Raymond listened silently. Then he asked them to leave. They returned a week later, this time with clearance badges and classified documentation. This time, they asked for Zoya directly. She met them in a glass-walled conference room. They spoke, she listened, then she asked one question. "Would you use it against citizens of your own country?" There was a pause. She stood up. "Meeting over." Raymond found her in the courtyard an hour later, pacing. "They'll come back," he said. "I know. We'll need a plan." "I have one," she replied, "but it requires a bigger audience." She wrote a letter, not to a government, but to the world. In it, she described the philosophy behind Zoe, the limits of its application, and the necessity of public oversight. She called for a global charter on algorithmic ethics, proposed a new open database of pattern mapping, and offered a toolkit for detecting manipulation in social systems. The letter was published in over 40 languages. It was signed by over 1 million people within a month. The agents never returned. Sarah eventually moved to Sweden, accepting a post as a UN advisor on algorithmic transparency. She stayed in touch, offering advice and reviewing the Phoenix program's security protocols. Before she left, she hugged Zoya tightly and whispered, "Make them earn your silence." Zoya nodded. One evening, months later, as the first spring flowers opened in the farmhouse garden, Zoya sat beside Raymond on the porch steps. "You ever miss it?" she asked. "What?" "The old life, money, power, spotlight." He considered it, then shook his head. "No, because then I had everything except meaning. Now I have meaning, and that's not for sale." Zoya looked at the sky, where stars were just beginning to emerge. "I used to think being different was the worst thing. Now I think it's the most valuable thing I have." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She smiled, not the reserved smile she showed the world, but the rare one, the private one, the one that lit her whole face. "Thank you for choosing me," she said. Raymond turned to her, eyes soft. "No," he said. "Thank you for letting me." They sat there as the night deepened, father and daughter not by blood, but by choice, by battle, by belief. And behind them the quiet hum of Zoe continued, no longer just a system, but a symbol, chosen and unstoppable. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video or explore the others on the channel, and don't forget to share this one with someone who'd love it too.